I'm Lai Yu Leong with the Center for Presidential History. Today is May 18th, and I'm interviewing Ambassador James Moriarty. Ambassador, let's start with your background. You were NSC Director for China starting 2001. What did you bring to that role?
Well, my wife and I had just returned from a lot of experience in China and Taiwan. We had served immediately post-Tiananmen in Beijing. Then after a few years off, we went back to Taiwan, where I did some more language and then was political chief in Taiwan and then political chief in Beijing. So I had a lot of China-Taiwan experience. Indeed, I was actually recruited to go back and be Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh desk in the summer of 2001, when my ambassador went and talked to Condi Rice, who was having a tough time finding a China-Taiwan director, and recommended that she talk to me.
What was your background before that?
Well, before that, I'd been Foreign Service for a long number of years. It came up later on, but I had also spent 3 years in Pakistan. Of course, that's why I was heading back to the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh desk. And a couple of years in Morocco, a couple of years in Swaziland. So a pretty varied Foreign Service career. 2 years working on UN Security Council affairs out of Washington, D.C. So a very broad experience.
Are you a Mandarin Chinese speaker?
Yes. My wife and I both spent a total of 3 years full-time learning Chinese. Used it for a total of 8 years working. So by the time I left Beijing the second time, my Chinese was good. I tested at a 4 in reading, and I'm pretty sure by the time I left Beijing, I would have been a 4 in speaking too.
What was your area of responsibility specifically? What was your brief as NSC Director for China?
Well, that would get back a little bit about what was going on with respect to the China relationship at the time. My tour in Beijing was a very interesting tour, my second tour when I was political counselor, because it was bookended first by the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Kosovo, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade because of the war in Kosovo, and then by the EP3 incident. The EP3 incident, if you'll recall, was right at the beginning of the administration of George W. Bush. It was interesting, of course, because during the campaign, then candidate Bush had spoken out strongly on the need for tougher, or at least a more balanced policy towards China. And the Chinese were very, very nervous when he came in. And for the first couple of months, the Bush administration had, I thought, been dealing with China, and this was while I was in China as political counselor, with kid gloves, very carefully dealing with them, not wanting to make it clear that they did not want to make an enemy out of China. And then, of course, the EP3 thing blew up, and after about 3 weeks of that, the new administration announced the Taiwan arms sale, which was fortuitous in some ways, because I think it buttressed a message that we had been giving the Chinese, which is that they were handling this EP3 thing almost as badly as they had handled the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade. No communication between other agencies other than the PLA and the leadership as to what had happened. No communications with the U.S. until the Chinese, had decided on what path they wanted to follow. And then obviously different from the bombing of the embassy in Belgrade, but the decision to hold our aviators for, it turned out to be, I think, 10 or 11 days, was pretty upsetting. And I don't think the Chinese understood how it poisoned the atmosphere back in Washington. So in that sense, the arms sale coming 3 weeks in, I think it was roughly around the 21st or 22nd of April, sort of underscored that the U.S. was pretty upset with China. Didn't help me. I got woken up at midnight to go receive a demarche from the Chinese about how angry they were. But yeah.
So you were in China at that time?
Yes, I left China in the summer. I think it was July of 2001. I was a political counselor at the time, and I was frequently acting DCM or chargé, particularly during those last 2 years of my time in Beijing. So I don't remember which I was at the time. I must have been acting DCM because I was the one who got yanked in to get yelled at by Yang Jiechi, rather than anybody else, and that normally wouldn't go to the political counselor. So yes, I was there. In fact, I think it was the following week that I flew back to Washington to interview with Condi. And speaking of jet lag, at that point, what happened was I got a call from the NSC, from a guy who had worked with me, asking me whether I would be interested in the job. And yeah, the director of the PAB does sounded interesting, but this sounded a lot more interesting. So I said yes. And I guess about 26 hours later, I was on a plane, landed around noon in Washington, and I had an appointment with Condi at 5 p.m. And speaking about jet lag, I was seriously jet lagged. This was flying economy class from Beijing after being all excited and wound up. So I can recall Condi ran a little bit late. It was about 20 minutes behind schedule that I got to meet with her. And so I'm trying to think, okay, Jim, how do you not appear a complete jet lagged fool? And I remember, as you said, sunlight. And at this point, the West Wing had not been renovated for security purposes like it has been since. So the waiting area in the West Wing, right next to the External Secretary's offices, looked straight out into that driveway coming into the White House. And there was a big old tree out there with sunshine shining at it. So I just looked at that tree for 15 or 20 minutes, trying to think about what I could say. And I must have done okay because later she offered me the job.
So we're clear on the dates. When exactly was that again, roughly?
The interview would have been early May. I came back from the tour in Beijing in July, took some leave, and I must have been on seat towards the end of July, beginning of August, which of course was a relatively slow time. And if I recall, unlike most years, nothing spectacular even happened that year. Usually in August when Washington wants to go to sleep, some crisis happens. But that was actually fairly sleepy August.
So you said it was a quiet summer.
Yeah.
And so you actually started with the NSC in August then?
End of July, beginning of August, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't even know where I'd look up the dates, but I think it was right around that period.
Okay. So in the period leading up to August 2001, broadly speaking, what was, as you understand it, what was the Bush administration's priorities as far as China is concerned?
I put it in a nice way earlier, trying to restore more balance in the relationship, but in practical terms, what that involved was trying to correct what was viewed as Japan passing. Okay, you had people in the new administration who had a lot of credibility in Japan and a lot of knowledge about Japan. There was no desire to intimidate or scare the Chinese, like I said earlier, but there was an obvious recognition that the relationship with Japan had to be improved as a key fundamental of the policy towards China. There was also, again, I think that is a large part of what informed the arms sale to Taiwan, to sort of the view that the Clinton administration in the second term had swung too far towards China without balancing other equities in the region.
I believe President Bush had talked about China as a strategic competitor.
Mm-hmm.
What did that actually mean?
I actually think, like I said, that a lot of that was campaign driven, basically sort of. I think there was a pretty broad acknowledgement that President Clinton flying over Japan at the end of a 9-day visit to China in 1998 was a pretty serious mistake. And I think that maybe there was a feeling that not only the experts, but a broad swath of the American people said, wait a sec, why are we cozying up to China so quickly at a time when China continues to do things that seem antithetical to our longer term interests. So I think that was what drove the rhetoric. As I said, from my view in Beijing, the first couple of months, the administration was pretty careful in making it clear that even if they viewed China as a, quote, competitor, that didn't preclude progress in a lot of other areas where we needed to cooperate.
Apart from the bombing in Belgrade and the spy plane incident, what were other issues that were thorns in the side of the relations?
Well, a big one were proliferation issues, and sort of not exactly a subset, but a related issue was also the plans towards the end of the second Clinton administration for a missile defense network. That drove the Chinese absolutely nuts, because at that point their nuclear arsenal was small enough so that a defense shield that could be effective against North Korea, the Chinese could actually logically feel might greatly inhibit their own nuclear deterrent against us. So there was a lot of controversy over that in the last couple of years of the Clinton administration. Those were the biggest issues, and of course the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade had its own subtext, which was that Zhu Rongji went to Washington in March of 1999 with a deal on WTO accession that the Chinese thought we couldn't refuse. This was too good. There's no way we could refuse it. President Clinton thought he didn't have the backing to get it through, so we refused it. He went back, and then 5 weeks later we bombed the embassy in Belgrade. So again, the Chinese being the Chinese, they tie things together, and they see this as an overall attempt by the U.S. to cool the relationship, maybe thinking about the criticism about Japan passing and stuff like that. But that was the backdrop to that. And then, of course, from our perspective, I think in the embassy in Beijing, something that I've never seen anywhere get covered is the fact that, okay, after the bombing and their rampaging against our embassy consulates, the burning of the CG's residence in Chengdu, the Chinese were looking for a way to repair the relationship. And after we settled, the compensation for the two sides, we actually resumed talks about WTO accession. And then by end of October, beginning of November, we had come back to basically the same deal with a few words changed. And we proclaimed that, hey, we're getting satisfied with this. And the Chinese at that point had to figure out, okay, what do we do domestically? And so I think it was early November. One day, the second lead story, the second most prominent story on the front page of the Beijing Qingyan which was at that time the largest populist paper, non-party paper in Beijing, covered a story saying that the defense attache's office in the embassy in Belgrade had been relaying military information to the Serbian forces in Kosovo. So great big story, front page of this very prominent newspaper and widely circulated newspaper, saying, okay, the folks that we took out were actually supporting the war effort in Kosovo. That was it. One day, nobody ever mentioned it to me. I've never seen anybody really pick up on it, but I'm convinced that that was the Chinese government telling the Chinese people that, yes, these American actions were inexcusable, but maybe they had a slight justification. So that kind of took care of that big issue in 1999. And then, like I said, a lot of discussion on proliferation, a lot of discussion on missile defense, trade issues. Like I said, we're moving ahead very, very nicely. That we agreed on the WTO accession package. They joined the WTO pretty shortly after that, and that began the huge economic boom of the first decade of this century. So those were the big outstanding issues. And frankly, the Chinese were very nervous about the election. And then when the election was undecided in the first day, they're all scratching their heads trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
I guess 2 follow-up questions. How did the U.S., well, you were still DCM in China at that time.
Political counselor, my main job.
Right. Yeah. So how did you respond to that news article? Was there a U.S. response?
We reported it back to Washington, and then 2 or 3 weeks later, we closed the WTO accession package. Sent it back in, and said, this, and gave about that analysis, saying, look, this looks to be an attempt on the part of the Chinese to dig themselves out of the hole and to explain why. I'm never going to use the word resetting, but why an improvement of the relationship with the U.S. at this time makes sense.
Right. How would you characterize the Chinese foreign policy at that time? That was a very pragmatic one then?
Yeah. Basically, the Deng Xiaoping, you've heard the phrase, and I can't do it in Chinese anymore if I ever could. It's basically keep your head down and build up your capabilities. Tao Guang, something like that. Anyhow, that continued to be the dominant thesis behind Chinese foreign policy up until 2008, 2009. Okay, and one of the characteristics is the Chinese were prickly. You could predict that they would be and of course I didn't mention Taiwan, although again, I went there at a funny time. Okay, I transferred directly from Taiwan, where I had seen the presidential election in '96, to Beijing in 1998, at which point the Chinese were trying to improve the relationship with Taiwan. Basically, Chinese policy failed miserably in 1996. And they were looking for a way to kind of repair the damage and reestablish a working relationship. So the traditional things that China had been most prickly about were what they called the core national interests, Taiwan and Tibet. Okay, sovereignty issues, sort of the unfulfilled mandate of the PRC, complete the reunification of the motherland. So those were big deals, and for them, on those issues, you could expect absolute obstinacy on almost anything. Other than that, they would get into shoving matches, they would get irritated with specific neighbors, but they'd always be very careful that as they were doing that, if they were in a fight with the US, they'd be in a relatively mild time with Japan, for example, or vice versa. You wouldn't take on India at a time when things were deteriorating with Russia, for example. So, they were very conscious of only making those two issues the things they would be willing to die for. And of course, anything that in their view threatened the stability of of CCP rule. Okay, so for example, again, something I don't think most people recall is that when the Clinton administration first came in, it made a real big deal out of human rights in China. Okay, and it argued that if China kept on going down the road of repression that started in Tiananmen, then the U.S. would have to review MFN status. China basically said, go ahead. We'll survive without you. At which point, since the Clinton administration also came in saying that the U.S. economy is the number one issue, it backed off pretty quickly and sort of stepped back from trying to make human rights sort of the single litmus test for all of the relationship with China. So you look at those things, survivability of the party, Tibet, Taiwan, those were the things that you would never get any compromise, any backing off from. And so that's why, so I make the cutoff date about 2008, probably 2009, after the big stimulus package. That changed totally.
When you were in China, what was your sense at that time, since it was the post-Cold War era? What was your sense of how the Chinese viewed the idea of the U.S. being a unipolar power, or did they even see it that way?
Well, okay, I was in Beijing 89 to 91, and then 98 to 01. Okay, 89 to 91, first of all, the real thing was absolute fear about what happened in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and particularly Ceausescu being hung from a lamppost scared them very badly. And that was the context for why they looked at re-centralizing control over the economy in addition to the political system. And it was only Deng Xiaoping who was able to blast them out of that. By 91, they were beginning to tout how the world was becoming multipolar. For my second tour, they continued to grasp desperately to see any signs of multipolarity. And frankly, as somebody who had worked on the collapse of the former Soviet Union, I saw the EU as being totally ineffectual in terms of foreign policy or security policy. But the Chinese continued to see the EU, particularly with the coming of the euro, as a more and more effective pole, particularly since the Europeans were extremely careful about staying on the right side of China. So when you saw them join the AIIB and everybody says, oh, I'm shocked, what a surprise, they're putting commercial interests before the relationship with the US. They always have, as far as I could tell. But I think even the Chinese now will admit that the EU is not an effective pole. Throughout that second tour, though, 98 to 01, even with the Soviet Union getting more and more messy, and don't forget Japan. When the multipolarity became a fad immediately after the Cold War, it was Europe, the US, Russia, Japan, and China were going to be the poles. After a decade of slowdown, stagflation, whatever you want to call it, Japan wasn't looking like that much of a pole. But, throughout that period, the thinkers in China continued to want to believe that multipolarity would someday somehow spring up. I think the 9/11 changed that to some degree. And then the Great Recession changed it again.
Right. Before we get to 9/11, though, the 2000 presidential election, what was their view about George W. Bush becoming president?
They were nervous. They don't like changes in administrations, and they thought Gore would give them continuity, and they thought they had a decent working relationship with the Clinton administration. So, particularly given comments about strategic competitors, about the need for arms sales to Taiwan during the campaign by then candidate Bush, I think they were very nervous going in. They would have much preferred Gore win, I think. And, to be fair, they would have preferred George H.W. winning a second term to Clinton winning. Change makes them nervous.
Did the people in China that you had interactions with, were they familiar with the people who were going to come into the foreign policy establishment with George W. Bush? So Condi Rice, Armitage, Powell?
No, not too much, no. No, they were not. In the 90s, it wasn't sort of the touchstone where everybody had to pretend that they had some China chops. And so, I think all of them maybe had a little bit of experience of China, but all would have been very careful about proclaiming themselves China experts. And so, no, I don't think they knew Condi particularly, or Armitage, or Secretary Powell. They were basically looking at writings and past performance in other fora.
Wolfowitz, no.
Wolfowitz maybe had a little bit more of a profile, having been ambassador in Indonesia. But no, I don't think they were particularly familiar with the incoming team. And also don't forget that U.S. studies were picking up, but they're nowhere near where they are now. In terms of numbers, that would be a fascinating study, but I'd be stunned if you had 1/10 the number of academics in China studying the U.S. as you do 15, 16 years later.
Okay, so that brings us up to 9/11. So 9/11, the morning of, when the events began to unfold, where were you, and what were the thoughts that ran through your mind?
I was at the BWI airport, and I was shocked, and I said, the next thing that ran through my mind is, oops, we're probably going to have to drive up to Hanover, New Hampshire. I was taking my son off for his freshman year in Dartmouth. And we did indeed end up driving up. We drove up the almost empty New Jersey Turnpike, I guess about 5 or 10 miles west of the Twin Towers, which had been obliterated, and you saw great clouds of black smoke in their place billowing up into the sky. And then we finished driving up to New Hampshire, dropped my son off at 2 a.m., and by about noon, we were heading back down to Washington.
You weren't called back right away?
Yeah, they couldn't. Plus I was a China hand. So, nobody thought that these were Chinese planes doing this. So no, I was taking my son off to college, and it turned into something I didn't expect. So I got back, I don't even know what day of the week. What day of the week was?
I believe it was a Tuesday.
Tuesday, yeah. So I would have gotten back in the office on Thursday. And frankly, there were some scares still floating around about what was going on. There were anthrax scares later on. But the first big event really came about 2 weeks later. There were two things. One was the fairly immediate debate as to whether the president would go to APEC, which was going to be in Shanghai.
In October.
Yeah, in October. And he decided he would go. And then the other big internal event in the NSC, and I don't know if any of your other people have mentioned this, was about 2 weeks later, Condi called an all hands on deck. And I think this was the only one I went to where we had over all 200 plus employees of the NSC gathered together. And she talked about how 9/11 was like, as former ambassador in Nepal, the day the tectonic plates shifted. Everything became jumbled. All the routes that you thought you were following, most of them don't exist anymore. New opportunities have opened, but there are new routes that we're all going to have to travel together. It was a very moving, very effective talk, and it did sort of lay things out to some degree. And I got to be cautious there because as we talk more, I'm going to say, there was a reasonable amount of continuity. In some areas, there was less continuity in other areas. And perhaps some of the things that were not priorities before, but were less directly tied to 9/11, would not have become the priorities they did become later on.
So even though you weren't called back, presumably you had thoughts running through your head as NSC Director for China. What were those thoughts in terms of, U.S. and China?
Well, I was willing to bet that the Chinese would react sympathetically, and they did very quickly, and that then the Chinese would quickly try to figure out how they could advance their own national interests using this. And, this did not precisely coincide, but it was pretty simultaneous with the rise of the ETIM, the East Turkmenistan Independence Movement. And, I very quickly realized or believed that the Chinese would use this as a good excuse to keep the lid on their own minorities. And it was going to be very complicated because, and to some degree, some small fraction of them are doing things that we would consider terrorism against a context where we feared that would be used as an excuse for greater repression. But like I said, my immediate question was, could we convince not just the president but his security apparatus to go ahead with the trip to Shanghai? Mm-hmm. And we were able to. Mm-hmm. And that was the probably the most testosterone event in terms of security that I've ever witnessed in my life, because you had the Chinese hosting, and you had the Russians and the Americans there, the three most active protective services in the world, all there in the immediate aftermath of this huge terrorist attack. So they closed off all of Shanghai, basically. They kept people out of probably about a 10-block radius in the middle of town. Let nobody in except for the official delegations. And it came off okay. Substantively, we began the push to get things that we wanted to see with respect to security into the APEC agenda.
Mm-hmm. So in that month or so immediately after 9/11, did you get a sense of anyone suggesting to you, hey, let's see how we can manage China or keep a lid on China so that we can focus on other stuff that's going on?
No, and no, I never did. Never heard anything like that. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, does attention shift to other issues? Mm-hmm. Of course. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So when Secretary Rice, or I guess at that time she was NSC advisor, so when she gave that briefing 2 weeks after, besides speaking generally, as you described earlier, did she give any specifics? Did she talk about how priorities might shift, or what sort of opportunities or constraints are now emerging?
Yeah, and I am reaching here a little bit. I know she mentioned that obviously the war on terrorism is going to be a huge priority, but I'm pretty sure she also mentioned that, that doesn't get rid of our other interests. It does become a prism through which we'll have to look at many of our other interests. By no means all of our other interests, but many of them. I think that's what she said. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I would have been totally alarmed.
So what was your sense of how attention shifted to other issues? How did that affect your work, for instance?
Actually, very little initially in the China-Taiwan job. Very little. Mm-hmm. We were able to pull off a fairly successful trip by the president to Shanghai. That went pretty well substantively. We had gotten through the arms sale. So, in effect, we were cleaning up, and geez, how can I forget this? But we're also wrapping up the mess of the EP3, and everybody was trying to put that behind them. I would say, in a way, that this might have shifted a little bit, definitely shifted focus from China in OSD, at least. I mean, there was a lot of anger at the way China had handled the incident, particularly at the highest levels of OSD. The uniforms, I think, realized that they had to work through it, but there was anger, and people were really chewing on that bone. But frankly, after 9/11, that seemed much less urgent. So in that sense, I think it might have served to make people realize, particularly in the context of good comments, good public comments, good private comments from the Chinese on their sympathy after the attack. I think it helped get over the EP3 incident more quickly than we would have otherwise. And obviously in China itself, but just as importantly, inside the Beltway.
What about in terms of resources? So not merely attention, but budget, all of that. Was there any change?
No, but don't forget, you're dealing with bureaucracies that move slowly. And when I say no, I shouldn't be that categorical, because first with the war in Afghanistan and then with the war in Iraq, you saw a massive shift of military resources. Okay. And again, I'm from Hawaii, so I can see PACOM resources finally starting to drift back from the Middle East. In terms of civilian resources, no. But I don't know if you're aware of this figure, but as of I think 98 or 99, the Western Europe had the exact same proportion of the State Department budget and State Department personnel as it did in 1947. I guess that's about 110 countries later that we have embassies in. Indeed, there was a shift of diplomatic resources begun under Secretary Powell and Armitage, continued under Condi, largely from Europe, to some degree from Latin America, to the Middle East and Asia, including EAP. Japan was the only post, I think, that lost some resources during that period. China definitely added quickly. Mm-hmm. When I was in China, at one of those times when I was acting DCM or something, we were looking at, when we finally got permission, what kind of new embassy would we be building? And at that point, we had about 125 direct hire Americans in Beijing, and we had about 175 or 200 nationwide, adding in the 4 consulates. And the OBO, the buildings guy, comes in and says, you've only got 125 here now, so we should build towards about 200, 210 full-time American employees. And I look absolutely aghast at him and I say, no. In 10 years, instead of a 12-person political section handling the work of DEA, FBI, HHS, I named about 6 federal agencies that I had officers spending 20% of their time on. You're probably going to have all those agencies here, and they're all going to have at least 2 officers, 1 secretary, all of them Americans. That's the political section I'm talking about. Multiply that by the other sections, build the admin section to support those other sections, and you should be looking not at South Africa as your comparator, because South Africa at that time had more employees than the embassy in Beijing. You shouldn't be looking at that as your comparator, you should be looking at the largest embassies in the world as your comparator. And they ultimately built it for about 400, and it's too small. So, why did I get on that digression?
So resources, we're talking about resources.
No, so even the embassy in Beijing continued to grow even after 9/11. There was renewed focus, of course, on places like Indonesia, Pakistan, which was in theory under my purview, at least initially at the NSC, surged immensely. India grew fairly rapidly during that period. So no, there was no drain of resources from Asia to the Middle East, if that's what you're asking about. Like I said, the military surged troops, but there was an acknowledgement that Asia was increasingly important.
So there was no sudden swerve.
In terms of focus of the top?
That's right.
Yeah, probably, but not in terms of surging resources. And now the other thing to keep in mind is that in folks like Armitage and Wolfowitz, you really had Asia hands in senior positions. And that's was almost like a first. Maybe you could go back and find other senior, deputy secretaries of state who had vast Asia experience, and particularly Japan experience. I don't think so. So, in a way, you did see, I would argue, more activism on Asia, particularly Japan, even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, than you had under the previous administration. So I don't know. It's hard to tell. I mean, I think to a degree people had good deputies and trusted them. And to have deputy secretaries of defense and state paying a lot of attention was a big deal. It was very helpful.
Were they very hands-on in terms of China?
In terms of China, no, not particularly. I don't want to. Well, let's put it this way. We got through the APEC Shanghai summit. We continued to work making sure that the odds and sods left over from the EP3 incident were cleaned up. We continued to get batted around over the Taiwan arms sale. But basically, the relationship was pretty stable, okay? Particularly given the way it had started out that year. And I think by the end of the year, you could say that we were pretty much over the double whammy of the EP3 and Taiwan arms sale, which was pretty good, and in a way 9/11 contributed to that. Trying to read China, I think they saw the huge outpouring of sympathy for the U.S., and they publicly and privately were part of that outpouring. So they probably realized that, hey, cut them a little bit of slack right now. And seeing the U.S. being so active, I think, caused them some concern too. They didn't want to prod the bear when it was angry.
Were you asked for specific input for the APEC summit?
Yeah, I have no idea what it was. We had an econ guy, and much of it was econ driven. We started getting into a little bit about security, but it was 2002, 2003 where we really started to try to push to see whether we could get things like support for the PSI, Port Security Initiative, I guess that is. Or anyhow.
Where the customs would inspect the stuff before they get exported.
Right, exactly. So I don't want to, do this ex post facto But yes, yeah, okay, I cleared out all on much of the stuff going to the president, and we wrote the short memo for him. Presidential visits to most places, state would do a lot of the drafting, and we would usually get a crack at it, or we would write our own much briefer points on what we thought the president should try to get out of specific meetings.
President Bush's speech at APEC has been characterized as very generous towards China, praising China for its response to 9/11 and so on. Did you write that brief?
I didn't write the speech. Speechwriters wrote that. But I think that like I said, there was an acknowledgement that the Chinese were trying to be gracious and trying to put it behind. So the argument we made was, hey, take it and run with it. There's no reason we would want an unfriendly relationship with China at this time. They are, by Chinese standards, holding out olive branches. So take it. Thank them for it. And I think the president realized he'd catch a little bit of right-wing flack on it, but it wasn't at a time when he had no concerns about that. It wasn't, he could handle that, he thought.
Right. Were you surprised at the support that the Chinese extended, or was that predictable given how pragmatic the Chinese are?
Oh, it was predictable. Oh, yeah. I mean, they are made uncomfortable by anything that threatens existing regimes. And I think even by then, they were worried about terrorism as a tool to attack the legitimacy of regimes. So, yeah, I couldn't imagine them supporting a bunch of Muslim terrorists against the United States of America. Even if some in China might say, oh, it's nice to see the U.S. get a little bloodied nose, I think the vast majority would say, wait a sec, if this can happen to the U.S., can't it happen to China too? So yeah, no, I thought the reaction was predictable.
Now, by October, the U.S. had launched the war in Afghanistan. Was that before or after APEC?
I think it was after or right around. Okay. Yeah.
And so what was the Chinese response to that? It was one thing, to subscribe to the rhetoric, something else to see actual action.
Well, I and here I'm projecting, it must have been okay because it wasn't a big deal, okay? And again, projections of power make the Chinese very nervous. But, did we have a legitimate casus belli? Yeah, probably. I mean, again, the Chinese weren't going to cross us on that because they wanted to keep their options open either, even though they never interfere in the internal affairs of other nations and have never invaded any country except all of their immediate neighbors. They would want to keep their options open so that if they had a casus belli, they wouldn't have us saying, well, gee whiz, you wouldn't let us attack, or you opposed our attacking a country that was protecting the launchers of an attack that killed more people in Pearl Harbor.
You didn't get a sense of nervousness, especially with Pakistan being involved, because of course they have a complicated relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah. That's interesting. I've been asked about China's relationship with Pakistan since 1985 or 6 or something like that when I was in Pakistan. And I think to a degree, the swing back to the U.S. must have made them nervous to some degree, but they'd seen it before and realized that, they can probably outlast this too. Yeah, I think in this case, both sides semi-believe their own rhetoric, that the relationship is kind of an all-weather one that will continue no matter what the buffets of current events are. So yeah, I don't think that the swing back was probably hugely welcome, but I don't think that it made them particularly afraid of their own footing in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm. What about the national security strategy that was outlined in 2002? To what extent did you contribute to that?
I contributed on the parts by then under my broader purview, which was all of Asia, mm-hmm. All of East and South Asia and the Pacific. So there was a fairly prominent China part that I did get to see and I did comment on, and I think most of my comments were accepted, but I haven't reviewed it recently, so I can't recall. Was there a part on India? I can't even recall. So yeah, I did get to review it, and I again was satisfied with the final mm-hmm. product. In contrast to the State of the Union address where they talked about the axis of evil, mm-hmm. that was not run through us. Mm-hmm.
Even though it mentioned North Korea.
Yeah. But yeah.
Is that typical?
Well, I'm trying to recall if we saw other State of the Union addresses. I know we didn't see that one because Mike Green, who was doing Japan and Korea at the time, was very upset with it. And I can't really recall if we saw the other State of the Union addresses. I just don't know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So back to the NSS then.
Yeah.
So you were given a copy to review.
Mm-hmm.
Did anything surprise you? I ask it because, it's been characterized by scholars as a sort of strategy of transformation. That it really took the U.S. in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wondered if that occurred to you when you were reviewing it.
Oh yeah, but again, look at the broad sweep of U.S. foreign policy for 237 years. We have always swung between being an ideological power and a realist power, okay? And you can predict that it will come. Mm-hmm. It can come with just changes of parties, but it usually comes because of dramatic events, okay? And I think the sort of, I don't know whether this is the right thing to say, but frequently we are pragmatic when things are comfortable. Mm-hmm. When we become threatened, then we swing to idealist because we see a world that has become threatening while we've tried to do the pragmatic thing. Mm-hmm. Okay? And in that sense, it didn't surprise me. And frankly, if you put me on the idealist pragmatist scale, I'm probably, 0.1% over to the idealist. Mm. Because what are we? We are the last great ideological country. Absent our Constitution, absent our commitment to the laws of the land, we're 320 million separate voices. We share a history, except for that large number of people who've been here for one generation or less. We share a culture, except for people who come from many different cultures. We're not going to have a majority in this country in whatever it is, 10 years. So the Constitution, our values, and our ideals are what bind us together, and they have been from the beginning. So if we abandon that ideology, that idealism behind it, then we don't have much for the world, and then we have a tough time informing what our pragmatic choices should be even. Yeah, you got to deal with some slugs, mm-hmm. but to what degree do you have to deal with all slugs? Mm-hmm. When does a slug become totally unacceptable? Okay, so those are unless you have some core ideology, you can't answer those questions, you probably can't even ask them. Okay, so yes, clearly you could see it was a swing towards that ideological thing. We are facing threats. We are facing threats because there are nasty people out there. to prevent those nasty people from doing horrible, horrible things to us, we'll do whatever is necessary. Okay? So, in a way, it was like Pearl Harbor. And again, getting back to more people dying on 9/11 than during Pearl Harbor. And at that point, I think the administration believed it had both the American people and most of the world behind it. Not behind that rhetoric, but behind in terms of supporting the U.S. response to 9/11 in general.
I realize it's been a while, but do you recall if there was anything that really sort of jumped out at you and that made you think, wait a second, maybe that's going too far?
You want me to say something that I actually didn't think? I did not think that. I could understand where we were going. I could actually see that, a lot of people aren't going to like this, and that, again, it's easy to caricaturize. I didn't think I was working with a bunch of warmongering idiots. And so, even if you put in a general principle, the question is, how do you implement that principle? And I had confidence, maybe too much, but, no, I won't say that. That's kind of mean. But I had confidence that the question was going to be the implementation. And frankly, if you have credible intelligence that somebody is planning a potentially disastrous attack against the United States, is the President of the United States doing his or her job if he doesn't respond before that threat comes to fruition? And that's basically what that NSS was saying. So it depends on how you look at it. Ex post facto, Iraq War, 12 years later, you can say, oh my God, why didn't saner heads prevail? But I get back to, if President Roosevelt knew that Japanese fleet was coming down, should he have sent the aircraft carriers out to attack it? Of course he should have. He should not have allowed the destruction of the Pacific Fleet. So, in effect, if you read it in that light and say, okay, this is sort of codifying things that nobody wants to think about and saying that, we will preempt if necessary. In my heart, I have hoped that all American presidents would be willing to do that. An extremely tough decision, but an extremely necessary decision.
Did you have a sense, once that strategy became public, how the governments in East Asia were going to respond to that?
Interesting. And again, I wouldn't. I assumed the Chinese would be uncomfortable with it. Okay. I also assumed that while intellectuals and academics would talk about it, and we might hear some about it, that frankly it wasn't going to be that big an issue with them. I did not think that they believed that we would be launching attacks against China under cover of this national security strategy. Okay. And other places in Asia, I guess the thing we have to avoid is looking at the world through our prism all the time. For example, this was getting back to a theme I touched on lightly, but the biggest things we were doing during my 2 years as special assistant to the president were not directly 9/11 related. They weren't really. And the biggest things that most of the countries were doing weren't directly 9/11 related either. And so, again, China had the intellectual capacity and the great power concerns, so you could guarantee people would be looking at this and they'd say, they growl and say this is in violation of the UN Charter. But this wasn't an issue they were going to pick a huge fight with us over. You could predict that. And it was an issue over which the masses of the Chinese would know absolutely nothing.
Sure.
So, Japan, Korea, they weren't going to worry about it. They were, Koreans contributed troops, and the Japanese tried to figure out how they could support in Afghanistan, and the Koreans were in Iraq too. So it was the Indians. They'd have some left-wing intellectuals complaining, but the Indian government was going to make it a big deal. And frankly, the nuclear standoff with Pakistan, for which I think the Indians actually gave us a lot of credit in helping to diffuse, was so much bigger than a document released by the U.S. government. So I don't know. I mean, maybe I'd have felt different if I was in the field rather than Washington, but I didn't see a whole lot of blowback on it immediately.
Not a lot of blowback immediately, but later, or
no, not really. Don't forget, I went off to South Asia in 2004.
Right. So would it be accurate then to say that maybe the NSS of 2002 created talk among scholars, maybe the media, but in terms of the day-to-day, in terms of actual policy making, it really didn't have a big effect?
No.
Okay.
Let's put it this way, at least it got more press than the one that got published 2 months ago. Which quickly disappeared into the depths of nowhere.
So it didn't generate much internal debate? I mean, was there much internal debate after 9/11 in terms of, okay, where are we going? You did mention that Dr. Rice said, all right, now this is going to be the sort of new prism for looking at the world or our policies. Was there much debate, or was it very much sort of top down?
I think people looked at individual issues, and then if they felt they were 9/11 related, would play that angle. If they weren't 9/11 related, they had to make the case why this was important for U.S. interests. And that's not that hard if it is important for U.S. interests. So, I mean, since the attack on the parliament in New Delhi came out of a Muslim group, and it was affecting, our crucial ally in the war in Afghanistan, it obviously was very important for what we were doing in 9/11. North Korea saying it had a highly enriched uranium program had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11.
Right.
And yet it became a huge focus. And a very divisive issue within the government, and it had nothing to do, none of the arguments had anything to do with 9/11. It was an issue looked at on itself for its importance to broad U.S. interests. And other interests that weren't that, again, had little, if any, connection to 9/11, including the China relationship.
So would it be correct to say then that, as far as people like you were concerned, in your day-to-day policy making and thinking through issues, it wasn't as if you went around always aware of 9/11 and that it played a big part. Is that correct?
Right. It was just on specific issues. And if you look at the broader sweep of East and South Asia, you had Jemaah Islami in Indonesia, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. And those were issues seen through a 9/11 prism. And the rejuvenation of the alliance with the Philippines, I think, probably might not have happened to the degree it happened absent 9/11. Indonesia, we don't know Indonesia well, we never have, but we think it's important. So, without 9/11, we'd have been reaching out to Indonesia. And, that process would have happened anyhow. Philippines, I'll give you, there's one, I think, where things happened that might not have happened without 9/11.
Primarily with the Abu Sayyaf?
Well, there was a recognition by the president that Abu Sayyaf was a big deal, that the Philippines was an ally, a treaty ally. And I mention this because there was a lot of suspicion of the Philippines throughout the U.S. bureaucracy. There were a lot of people who'd been involved in the negotiations over the renewal of the treaty bases, and they all felt personally wronged by the Philippine Senate decision not to ratify the treaty that was agreed to. So, without the president being willing to push, I think the relationship with the Philippines would have continued to languish.
Did you agree?
And I mean that not just with respect to helping them with Abu Sayyaf, but more broadly.
Did you agree with President Bush calling Southeast Asia the second front in the war on terror?
Did he call it that?
He called it that.
Gosh, I must have contributed that at some point. Sure. It helped improve relations with the Philippines and Indonesia. So, yeah, and actually, again, I'm going to jump to other questions you have later on, but there was a question of a lot of people assuming that Gulf Wahhabism was what Islam was all about, and therefore you could use a one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with fundamentalist groups throughout the world. And obviously, for somebody who was working with countries that were either democratic or semi-democratic, that had a history of vibrant oppositions and, a reasonable amount of intellectual freedom, and no domination, no historical domination by Wahhabism at all in their Islamic communities, the solutions were going to be very different. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, I argued consistently that, when you look at South and Southeast Asia, you have to use a different optic, mm-hmm. and not assume that you're dealing with governments that are Wahhabi themselves, mm-hmm. and not assume that you're dealing with populaces that are predominantly Wahhabi themselves. Mm-hmm. In other words, you've actually got a lot more policy options and probably much more willing governments on your side. Mm-hmm. So good language. I probably wrote it myself, and it did make a lot of sense given the vast differences of the problems they were facing.
Mm-hmm. When you say a lot of people early on, what did you mean a lot of? Who were these people?
Well, if you look at a lot of the public writing, it comes down that way, and frankly, a lot of the initial debate within the administration, I think, was assuming that. Mm-hmm. That the real enemy was Gulf Wahhabism. Well, frankly, Gulf Wahhabism was the stimulus for a lot of the problems in these other countries. But the other country contexts were so different that you had to begin looking at these as very different problems.
So there was an awareness within the administration then that perhaps different instruments were required?
I think that grew with time. Yeah, I think there was an acknowledgement of that over time, but it took a while.
Mm-hmm. Took a while, meaning how long?
Oh, a year, 2 years. I mean, by the time I left the NSC, I thought we were pretty clear in differentiating the problems in India and Indonesia and the Philippines from the problems we were facing in the Gulf.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was there pressure from politicians, congressmen, say, to be perhaps less subtle in your approach?
I didn't feel it. If there was, no, I didn't feel that. I think don't forget that initial analogy was very apt. The tectonic plates had shifted, and everybody was trying to figure out how the heck you work in this new environment. Mm-hmm. So it's not as though we had a whole lot of preconceived plans about what we were going to do after an event like 9/11.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something else the president famously said was, you're either with us or you're against us.
Mm-hmm.
How did that affect how you went about your work?
Oh, it gave us great talking points for trying to get support for things.
Mm-hmm.
And
Did it make it easier or harder?
Made it a lot easier.
Mm.
A lot easier in the Asia case.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a quick comment here is that a parallel to people assuming that the problem was all the problem of Gulf Wahhabism was that people tended to look at this through a Europe-centric point of view. I'm losing my thread of thought there. Where were we going before that?
You're with us or against us?
Yeah, okay, because don't forget, in Europe, you had Germany and France very quickly. Well, actually, no. Schroeder initially said, I'm with you, which is one reason why the president never trusted Schroeder again. Mm. The French said, we're not with you right from the start. And so the president gave the French credit for that. Oh, he did, seriously. Yeah, never trusted Schroeder again. Schroeder privately told him he was with him, and then he decided with an election coming up it made more sense to be against him. And he contrasted this with, I guess it was coal and power when we did announced that we were going to put medium-range missiles in Europe, and he stood up to hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets. Schroeder thought it would give him an electoral advantage, so he went down the other way. In Europe, you had the heart of the EU saying, with respect to Iraq, we're not going to be with you. Mm-hmm. Okay? Your heart put to say anything like that occurred in Asia. Mm-hmm. Okay? Our traditional allies either fudged or were with us. China was not particularly vocal against us. So it didn't really happen. Mm. And again, when I get back to people looking at, what I meant to say is people frequently buy into the post-Iraq war view that most of the world opposed us on this. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the case in Asia. You didn't have most of the world opposing us with respect to Iraq. Mm-hmm. You didn't have fast swings in public opinion against us. Mm-hmm. You didn't. It just didn't happen. Mm-hmm. So I get back to the point that it made it easy for us to convince folks like the Philippines, even the Mongolians, that you had to send in token contingents at least to show that you were a friend of the U.S. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, that might have been the case in East Asia, but wasn't it the case in Southeast Asia, in Muslim Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia?
Malaysia and Indonesia had more. You're right. I don't want to. But again, Malaysia and Indonesia, I don't think anybody ever called Mahathir an ally of the United States. And Indonesia, like I said, we've never really understood. So, and again, there you did have, you're right, you did have you did have public reaction. And you did, but again, from what base to what base, I don't think you saw a huge slippage in views of the United States, even in those countries. I know you didn't in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. Opposition to specific actions, but no, it didn't cause a sort of revulsion. Again, because I go from, if you look at some of these polls that were done in 2007 and 2008, mm-hmm. Once you start looking at non-Europe, non-Latin America responses, there wasn't a huge drop-off in view of the United States.
Mm-hmm. When did you make that shift from being director of China and the NSC to the bigger portfolio?
January, as acting, okay. Torkel Patterson left at the end of December or beginning of January, I forget which. And even though I wasn't a deputy, when I came on, everybody told me that I'd be kind of a deputy because I was obviously the China hand, and I had, I had the most experience of anybody there. So, they didn't bring me on formally as a deputy, but they had sort of called me kind of a deputy. And so then when Torkel left, Condi brought me in and said, your number one job is to find a replacement for Torkel. So about 3 months later, having failed miserably at that job, they gave me the permanent title of Senior Director and Special Assistant to the President. At which point I went and saw Andy Card, and he gave a little talk that I've never forgotten, which is, okay, you're getting this commission. And the commission for a special assistant to the president says something like, you're serving at the will of the president for the time being. So, I mean, literally, they got those two phrases somewhere in it, and it's not buried in it. It's very clear that you're there while the president wants you to be. And Andy Card mentioned that, look, you're going to be doing something that thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people would love to have the opportunity to do. It's going to be hard. You're going to work real hard at it. But at some point, your services are not going to continue. You're going to go on to something else. The president will ask you to step down, or you're going to leave for whatever reason. And at that point, I hope you'll remember those two phrases from your commission, and remember that you've been given one of the rarest and neatest opportunities that anybody in government can get. So, wow, pretty cool. Anyhow, so I think it was April that I signed on as full-time, well, not full-time, but I was named Special Assistant to the President, got my commission, and became the permanent Senior Director for Asia.
How often did you see the president in that position?
I would say for those 2 years, so from January of 2002 to January 2004, when I did step down, didn't get fired, I saw him on average once to twice a week. And probably closer to twice than to once. On average, when you take the times when I'm in his office 4 or 5 times in a week, if you take the trips. Saw him a lot.
Mm-hmm. So were they small meetings, big meetings?
They varied. I would go in for, say the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka is coming for a visit. I will go in for a pre-meeting that will be fairly small, and then we'll hold the meeting itself that I'll sit in on. And I'll hope that they have a State Department person willing to take notes, or else I take the notes. Okay. A lot of the foreign trips would be very small, and I would be in with the president and a foreign leader, maybe an interpreter, and I'd be taking the notes on some of those, or a lot of those. So the APEC trips were an incredible grind, but fun. We'd also be brought in on specific issues. And when I say we, I made a point, and I don't think all the senior directors did this, but I made a point that, say we were talking Japan, I would make sure that Mike Green came in with me. And the president never objected to that. Karen Brooks would come in with me if we were talking about Indonesia. So I would have frequent meetings that would be these things getting ready for foreign meetings. I would have occasional meetings where the president would ask us not only to go through stuff coming up, and again, even those meetings, getting ready for meetings, I would usually have the director with me. So those would be 3 to 4 person meetings. The National Security Advisor or the deputy would usually be in. Saw him a lot, wrote him a lot.
Mm-hmm. How engaged was the president in those meetings? Was it mostly you just briefing him, or what was it like?
Depends on the topic. He would almost always give some feedback. Sometimes it would be just kind of funny one-liners. Sometimes he'd get concerned and kind of push back on a point. Yeah, thought I knew him fairly well and talked to him a lot.
Mm-hmm. Did you get a sense that he had a good grasp of the policies?
Absolutely, because I would say that on every major issue I dealt with him, he came out with positions that I thought were very good and reasonable. Okay, so if you look at some of the things we were trying to do, I'd say the biggest focus for those 2 years was trying to address post-9/11 concerns while pursuing the longer-term concerns. And maybe from my perspective of China, as somebody who had, from the early 90s, been saying that we had to figure out how to deal with China as a rising power, and that one of the 3 keys to that was making sure we get the neighbors right. Okay, so I felt very strongly that the 2 key neighbors were Japan and India. Okay, subsequently, China did everything necessary to ensure that we got Japan right. and to give credit where credit is due, the folks like Armitage, Jim Kelly, Mike Green, they could show the Japanese the love that the Japanese desperately longed for. But basically the Chinese were helping us get Japan right. But India was this great unknown. And throughout the 90s, I think much of the Indian bureaucracy and a good portion of the Indian political class and intellectual class sort of bemoaned the collapse of the Soviet Union and the flexibility that the Soviet Union gave India in dealing with the outside world. But everybody always looked at India and say, what's the potential there? I mean, it's democratic, it's big, it's right below China. So that's a long way of saying that throughout the 2 years where I was senior director, if you look at what we were trying to do, a lot of it was geared towards trying to dehyphenate things and do things simultaneously. And part of it, at least in my eyes, was to make sure that we got China right over the longer run. So the 2 big dehyphenations were kind of like China, Japan. Can we improve relations with both of them at the same time? And I would argue we did that pretty effectively. And the other was India, Pakistan. Can we dehyphenate that relationship and improve ties with both of them simultaneously? And I would say, yeah, we did that. So those were the big fronts. Southeast Asia, we had opportunities. I think we took them pretty well with respect to the Philippines and Indonesia. Malaysia's Malaysia. They have politics with a very small p. Who's going to run UMNO? Can UMNO keep on stealing elections? All these important questions. But basically, there was a move to make sure that we got India and India, Pakistan right, Japan, China right. And the assumption was that would, over the longer term, put us in a much better position with respect to China.
So we were talking about President Bush and how he responded, to these meetings with you, and you were saying that, he was actually very engaged.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Could you give specific examples?
Oh, let's see. The things that I said were on the big issues, he tended to come out where we thought he should come out. Okay, so for example, the biggest issue, which had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, was of course the North Korean HEU program. Jim Kelly went out there at the beginning of October of 2002, and we had gotten this intelligence information indicating that the North Koreans, were purchasing things that could be used to build centrifuges And Jim Kelly had a meeting where he said, hey, we're worried about this. These could be used for an HEU program. And the North Koreans said, yeah, we're building an HEU program. Okay, so nobody expected that. That wasn't the answer we expected or frankly wanted. But that touched off a huge intramural debate. Okay, the context of this was that there were people who believed the agreed framework was a complete failure, that we had given the North Koreans time and provided them money while they built an HEU program. There were other people who maintained that, well, we at least put the plutonium program under wraps, and we were continuing to talk. I don't know if you recall, but towards the end of the Clinton administration, there was actually a big push to see whether we could exchange embassies. Anyhow, that debate kicked up immediately, in the next 2 weeks. And it was about 2 weeks later that we held a real National Security Council meeting, meaning the president and the chair, with all of the senior department heads on the National Security Council present, and the vice president present. And people presented these very opposing views that dialogue's important, we got to keep talking to the North Koreans. And the president came down where we wanted him to, which was basically that the history shows that we don't really have the leverage to convince the North Koreans to give up that which they want to do. They've shown us that. Okay, that's what the failure to stop the HEU, or the failure to prevent an HEU program, proves, that they really want to build nuclear weapons. Well, we don't have much trade with them. We can cut off the oil shipments that we're doing under the agreed framework, and we obviously have to do that. Congress would have our heads if we didn't. So we're going to do that. But other than that, we don't have much leverage. We don't have trade. We can't bomb what we can't see. We have no idea where this HEU program is. So he said, can't bomb them, can't convince them by ourselves. Therefore, we need to get as much leverage as possible over them. And that's basically why you ended up with the six-party process. And that was something that we were advocating with him, to him directly. In terms of direct impact on individual meetings, yes, but my memory of specific details is vague after all these years. But I can remember we did have him primed for the meeting with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, since I raised that very well, and he did try to get his points across. But getting back to our jet lag conversation, Wickramasinghe was so jet lagged that this charming, urbane guy was almost incoherent. Oh. Yeah, it was too bad. The president was primed. He knew what he wanted to do. But the Prime Minister, who had literally gotten in like 6 hours before, was just, he was just one jet lag puppy.
It's good to know that, these sort of ailments affect, people at the top too.
Yes, people at the top are human beings, yes.
Now, just a little while ago, you also mentioned India. And President Bush, at least according to reports, had a very good relationship in terms of, with Indian leaders. Was that something that you noticed?
Yeah, although he did get very frustrated at one point. He worked it hard. Okay, I mean, he made a lot of phone calls to Vajpayee, met him. Their national security advisor, Brajesh Mishra, was a frequent visitor, was good. The president did get upset with him over trade issues. This was one of those things where we had a phone call pre-Cancun where the president was trying to get support for our proposals. And we talked to Vajpayee by phone, and you could hear that it was Vajpayee with 6 or 8 other people in the room. And the president asked for support straight up. And Vajpayee basically says something like, yeah, we'll be with you, or something like that. And the most logical interpretation was, oh yes, he's promising us support. I think it was their commerce minister, shows up in Cancun and immediately says, we can't support the U.S. proposals and stuff like that. So technically he was there in Cancun. But it was just one of those things where we later on let the Indians know that, Vajpayee was a little too cute by half, if that was what the intention was. And it would have been better to tell the president ahead of time, or to just have clearly obfuscated by saying, we'll take your views under consideration, or something like that. But yeah, I think he recognized the importance of the issue, and he put a lot of personal effort into it. He did develop personal relationships with both Musharraf and Vajpayee. He did give a lot of authority to Armitage, who he relied on to make sure that we didn't have a nuclear war, and try to keep a close eye on things South Asia, and let him, the president, know when he had to intervene.
How would you describe President Bush's personal relations, with other leaders in East and Southeast Asia?
They varied from leader to leader. He loved Koizumi, got along very good with Koizumi. They were in many ways soulmates. Just in a lot of ways they saw each other as kind of different versions of themselves in a different culture, partly because they both loved baseball. But anyhow, he really liked Koizumi personally. Jiang he couldn't figure out, I don't think, and that's just because the cultural differences are so big. And Jiang was the head of a collective leadership too, not as much as Hu Jintao was later on, but it was clear that there were things that he couldn't commit to or wouldn't commit to that President Bush felt that if he were in his shoes, he would have the authority to commit to. So I don't think he was always scratching his head after he talked to or met with Jiang Zemin. And of course, phone calls with Jiang Zemin. We didn't make that many of them because they're totally useless, very prescripted and stilted. Kind of like Gloria. I don't think he completely trusted her, though. But he liked her, and he was willing to help her and do as much as he could.
Of the Philippines.
Yeah, Gloria Arroyo. And that turned out to be fairly accurate. She was, her husband at least was pretty slick. Indonesia was constantly churning, and Megawati is extremely unimpressive. He liked and respected Lee Kuan Yew. And like I said, he actually had a pretty good relationship with Musharraf. He thought he was a guy that he could deal with, and he was. So let's see, who else? In East Asia.
South Korea?
Oh, you got to kick out of the Mongolians. You got to kick out of the Mongolians. South Korea was the one I was leaving for last because didn't trust Kim Dae-jung at all. Then it shifted to No Daewoo. And at least in the first few interactions they had, No Daewoo came off as incredibly earnest and incredibly naive at the same time. So that left the president kind of scratching his head a little bit, hoping that we could do better at doing business with No Daewoo than we ended up with Kim Dae-jung, who, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think the president viewed as part of the problem with respect to trying to come up with a reasonable North Korean policy. Because Kim Dae-jung was so stuck on the sunshine policy that he didn't want to admit that the agreed framework had proven a failure, and eventually he had to move. But basically, it was he found Kim Dae-jung difficult to deal with.
And just to go back to what you're saying about the Mongolians.
Mongolians came and they said they had a lot of experience in Iraq, dating back to, I guess it was the 1200s or 1300s, and they had an envoy who was sent into Baghdad, and the Pasha had the envoy beheaded and sent the head back out to the Mongolians, whereupon the Mongolians sacked Babylon, took over the city, and added it to the empire. Said, so, we know how to deal with them. It's a little bit rusty, so we're willing to help. And they did send a contingent. And I'm sure if he had had more time, he'd have gotten out there for a visit. But yeah, it's kind of tough to fit Mongolia in. It's a long way from anywhere.
So the Mongolians have a long memory too.
Well, the Mongolians have a long memory that they're perfectly willing to draw on.
And why was Megawati so unimpressive?
Have you ever met her?
I have met her.
She's very unimpressive.
Well, what exactly did President Bush object to?
He didn't object to it. I mean, he knew he had to work with her, but we held our meetings in Bali with her, and they were okay. But she had some good. She had one or two good people in her cabinet. I think it was the Commerce Minister, the lady whose name I never can remember, is good, and she was
for industry. So that's the one.
She's done industry, she's done commerce, and she's done trade. Right, all of them, right, I think. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. Yeah. She was good. She had a good part in the conversation. He met with religious leaders, but basically the rest of the government and Megawati herself were pretty unimpressive in those meetings. While I was there, he did not do any direct meetings with her, and he didn't call her up much. I don't think she did business that way. But anyhow, so it wasn't a strong relationship between him and Megawati at all.
Mm-hmm. Did these personal relationships affect bilateral relations at all?
Not much, no. No, I mean, he knew he had to work with China. He knew he had to work with Indonesia. Korea is kind of funny, though. Let's put it this way. This, again, after having said that it had nothing to do with 9/11, there was some relationship with 9/11 in terms of redeployment of U.S. forces. And as OSD looked at where to redeploy from, Korea and Japan came up. And I think they probably had an easier push than they would have at other times if the relationship with Kim Dae-jung and No Daewoo was better. But I don't want to say that. But basically it was OSD that was very uncomfortable, particularly with the relationship with Korea. And when I say OSD, I mean the very highest levels of OSD. Were uncomfortable with the relationship with South Korea, did not consider the South Koreans particularly reliable allies, and therefore did not want to see us staying at whatever it was. I think we had 38,000 at the time, and we took out 10,000 or something like that. And we're now down to 27 or 28. So, that might have had some impact there. Maybe if No Daewoo had made a push, we'd have slowed down the removal of troops from South Korea. And over time, we've re-engaged and renegotiated with the South Koreans. But, in that first couple of years, there was a feeling that particularly under Kim Dae-jung, they had become so anxious to improve the relationship with North Korea that they were ignoring some key security concerns that we had, and why under those conditions should we keep such a large trip line up there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One criticism of President Bush's foreign policy approach has been that he sort of set aside multilateralism for unilateralism. Mm. Do you think that that's a fair comment?
Well, depends on how you define multilateralism. I mean, he was very conscious and put a whole lot of effort into trying to make sure he went into Iraq with as much support as possible. Okay, now, one thing I like to remind people of is that Saddam Hussein owed billions of dollars to the Russians, the Chinese, the Germans, and the French. Okay, so when you look at the principled opposition to removing Saddam Hussein, that, by the way, made anything impossible in the UN Security Council. And even though, of course, the Iraqis were in flagrant violation of, 15 or 16 Chapter 7 resolutions, which, of course, in theory, they're bound to uphold, and in theory could lead to use of force. You're saying, okay, define what you mean by multilateralism. Is it only going through the UN Security Council, even if you have vested interests that frees up the Security Council? Don't forget, from the Korean War up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Security Council made a practice of avoiding any difficult issues that involved the Soviet Union and the United States, just because they couldn't get anything through. We're now coming back to that blessed state of affairs. Would we have gotten to where we are today without the invasion of Iraq in 2003? Absolutely. Absolutely. The invasion of Iraq had nothing to do with where China is today. It had nothing to do with where Russia is today. The freeze in the Security Council has everything to do with where Russia and China are today. So, multilateralism is in the eye of the beholder. If you try to reach out and you don't get a response from some countries, but you do get a response from other countries. Well, what do we have? 38 people in with us in Iraq, 38 countries. By most definitions, that's multilateral. Did it go through the Security Council? No. Why didn't it go through the Security Council? Because there was no history here? No. Because the French, the Russians, and the Chinese wouldn't let it go through the Security Council.
Well, of course, the news media have made fun of the coalition of the willing by saying that it's made up of all these small countries that don't really count, and many of them didn't even actually send troops. They merely provided technical support or monetary support.
Yeah, no, and those are valid arguments. On the other hand, you look at the coalition of the willing in Afghanistan. Okay, well, that was a good war because we deserved to be there. What did most people do? They sent a few trainers. The Germans tried to find ways so that their troops wouldn't engage. Turks ended up protecting Germans, German troops. I mean, it's I guess in a way, you expect competent, committed allies to fight the good fight, and you shouldn't expect either incompetent or, that's a harsh word, less competent, or not overwhelmingly committed. People who are going along just for the sake of the relationship and are not necessarily that competent. What do you expect them to do? In the first Gulf War, we did most of the fighting. We had a huge coalition, but we did most of the fighting. Second Gulf War, we did most of the fighting. Even more. So, I don't know.
What about in East Asia? Was there, what was the attitude towards, multilateral frameworks like ASEAN or the ARF?
Well, you mean in the administration or?
Yes, in the administration.
ASEAN didn't get much love, frankly. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't viewed as all that effective. And I got to explain, I just came from a year in Jakarta trying to setting up a aid project to help ASEAN. So I actually have a much more benign view than I did back then. And I think ASEAN has actually come a reasonable ways in the past decade. So there wasn't much belief that ASEAN was a net contributor to security in any way. There was some interest as to whether it could contribute economically, but it wasn't a real pressing issue. ARF, not that much interest really.
So that was driven just by the sense that they weren't very effective forums. Is that right?
Yeah, and they weren't that big or important. And the biggest problem that anybody who works on Asia in any administration is it's so darn far away. Okay? You can fly over to a meeting in Europe and be back the same day. Presidents have done that. No president has flown over to Asia and come back the same day. Even with the Concorde, you couldn't do that. So it's hard to get people to say, okay, we're going to fly over and do this, we're going to fly over and do that. Therefore, for fora that kind of would be nice to have presidential participation, you're really cautious about trying to get the president to commit. It's just difficult.
Right. What about the Foreign Service officers who were on the ground there? What was their attitude?
Towards
multilateralism versus, well, not multi, but towards these multilateral frameworks?
Well, don't forget, Asia has been so far behind Europe that I think a lot of Asia hands really do think in terms of bilateral relationships. It's very unusual. Compared to Europe, where everybody in Western Europe is used to thinking of Europe, it's very unusual to run into people who think of, quote, Asia. It's very unusual to encounter people who have any sort of broad experience in Asia. The languages are tough. I've served a lot in South Asia and East Asia, and I've learned a lot of languages just because I'm old now. There's very few people who do that. And even say, I do have friends who've served in 2 or 3 Southeast Asian countries, and they spend a year learning the language, then they're working in that capital, and whenever there's a summit, that capital gets all excited about ASEAN, and they all have a portion of the foreign ministry that follows ASEAN closely, and for the 3 weeks leading up to that, they're your best buddies, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And then the rest of the time, you're talking about Thailand's relationships with Myanmar, Thailand's relationship with Vietnam. If you're in the Philippines, you're talking about a whole bunch of different issues. And, we don't have officers who specialize in bilateral capitals on ASEAN issues. It's just, we're never going to have enough staffing to do that. And frankly, when I say the ministries have somebody doing it, well, usually they'll be doing it as part of a larger portfolio, doing ASEAN issues, spare time. So, it's so far behind Europe in terms of the development of a regional consciousness, and whether that's even Southeast Asia, which by far is the furthest along. But then you throw in, you're going to build in Northeast Asia, you say, okay, how do you build a regional consciousness out of Japan, China, and South Korea? That's virtually impossible at this point in time, and it will be for a long time.
Of course, now, in recent years, we've paid a lot more attention to China and the South China Sea and regional security in that regard. Back then, in the early 2000s, what was the approach or thinking in terms of regional security vis-a-vis the South China Sea and China?
Well, don't forget back then China wasn't much of a threat. You had blow-ups periodically in the South China Sea, but don't forget, I think it was 2002 where they signed the Declaration on a Code of Conduct with ASEAN. And that declaration specifically said that they wouldn't do all of the things that they're doing now that are causing us so much trouble. So in effect, I think it came after some blow up in the South China Sea. I can't even remember all the specifics, but in 2002, they said, hey, we're gonna work this out rationally. We're not gonna go out and develop resources on our own. We'll try to discuss bilateral development of resources, and we're gonna come up with a code of conduct so that we don't have any confrontations among our militaries and paramilitaries in the South China Sea. Of course, now they're doing all those things that they said they wouldn't do. They're no closer to a code of conduct than they were in 2002. So back then, South China Sea was not a big concern. East China Sea, Japan Sea wasn't a big concern. You You had blowups in the 90s there in the Senkakus while I was in Taiwan. Things weren't blowing up much the entire time I was at the NSC. So no, the regional, there weren't big regional issues like that popping up. You know, again, if you look at the biggest issue then, it really was the old issue, the old core interest, Taiwan. I'd say if you looked at the most confrontational things we were doing, they were kind of Taiwan driven. And that was because, and here, yeah, Chen Shui-bian ended up being much more antagonistic than we assumed he would be. And the Chinese responded predictably.
There's been talk that perhaps the U.S. went easy on China with a few implications. One being that China was then able to put on a so-called charm offensive that facilitated the rise of China today. Another implication was might have been the impact on human rights in the region, that the U.S. sort of took its eyes off that. Any basis for that sort of view?
No, I saw the question, and in your list it was mentioned with respect to human rights, and I was trying to think, I don't think anybody could argue that we were going any lighter on human rights than the Clinton administration was in the second term, for or in the last 6 years after it abandoned the human rights as the fulcrum for the relationship. We did raise it repeatedly with them. We participated in things, but in a way, we learned from the Clinton administration. We weren't going to say that if we don't get what we want on human rights, then we're not going to deal with the Chinese, because frankly, the Chinese view human rights as I said earlier, as one of those regime-threatening issues. This is being done to weaken the rule of the Communist Party of China. That's all the U.S.'s interest is in this stuff. If I look at other things, I'm hard put to say what the accusation is. I don't even know how they would say we were going soft on China. What specific?
I guess one was what you had mentioned earlier, the East Turkmenistan independence movement. That was put on the list of terrorist organizations. And some people have suggested, maybe that was a sort of quid pro quo with the Chinese government.
Don't forget, they were very unhappy with what we did with ETIM. Okay, they wanted active support. They wanted us to be pushing on it. In fact, one of the big controversies, one of the ones that I did not come out on the winning side, was the question of repatriation of Uyghurs captured in Afghanistan. And there, I argued, send them back to China. Cut a deal with the Chinese. Say we'll see them every 6 months to make sure they have all their fingernails. I lost on that. They were looking for places to send them, but they wouldn't send them back to China. Okay, so I don't think it was a presidential decision, but basically nobody would ever take the decision that we could engage with the Chinese to see if we could cut a deal on terms of return. The Chinese were pushing us for a return, and we never negotiated with them. We never engaged with them on it. Getting back to the human rights things, the defense minister was coming to Cao Guangcheng was coming to Washington. I think this was November of 2003. And Condi wanted to make sure that he didn't see the president, so she was going to see him. And I argued strongly, and this was because of human rights issues. She said, I don't want the president seeing him. The PLA was the ones who did Tiananmen, and they still have shaky issues on. And we were going through whatever the human rights atrocity of the week was with the Chinese. So I made the point that, look, with the Chinese, you give them your bottom lines and you make them absolutely clear so that they can never claim that they misunderstood what you meant. And so they understand what really are our core national interests. And then on everything else, you talk to them and you don't cause them needlessly to lose face. Okay, so I said, you can meet with Chun, you can have the president drop by for 5 or 10 minutes, and you can make all the points you need to on human rights, and they will have to get reported back into their system. You know, I know the system well enough to say that, okay, you know, he's going to come in with PLA guys, but one of them will actually be working for MSS, and it will get into their system. And so that's what we ended up doing, rather than saying, okay, you know, but is that kind of ignoring human rights? No, I mean, it was doing what we could. I thought you were going to raise Taiwan in the flap right at the end of my time in the NSC, because basically, the president sent me out twice with letters for Chen Shui-bian, as Chen kept on talking more and more seriously about things like a referendum on independence. And we had met with, I delivered the first letter, didn't get much traction. In the interim, had met with some of his experts on, the DPP experts, and now the government experts on mainland China. And having served in both Taiwan and mainland China, I was absolutely appalled that the Taiwanese seemingly, honestly, did not have any clue what red lines were for China with respect to the relationship with Taiwan. What would get them so angry that they would have to look at, that they would actually look at using force. And the Taiwanese were totally clueless. This was very different from Lee Deng-hui's crowd when I was in Taiwan. They actually had a fairly sophisticated understanding of China, not great, but not bad. And I had just come from, you know, serving consecutively in Taiwan, where I had dealt with the old group and found them okay when I went to Beijing, you know, comparing what I heard in Beijing to what I knew from Taiwan. But these folks were folks who had never spent much time in China and didn't really understand it. So it was kind of creepy to talk to them and listen to them blithely talking about things. Well, we could probably do a referendum. What would China do? Well, you know, that's sort of the kind of thing that you don't want to find out what they're going to do. And so that's the context of why I got sent out there a second time with a fairly tough letter from the president asking the Taiwanese, you know, we're not really in favor of unilateral attempts to change the status quo. We do not believe that a unilateral attempt by Taiwan to change the status quo would be accepted by Beijing. And I tried to lay out what that meant, and Chen just kind of talked over me. And I came back and I told the president that I had come back and I was actually more worried than I had been when you sent me out. Chen did not seem to get the message at all. And this was again, against the backdrop of, I guess it was Wen Jiabao coming out for a visit, and the president made a fairly strong statement at the time that became a big deal in Taiwan politics, and Taiwan, Chen Shui-bian rejected this and said, we'll hold a referendum if we want to. No, they didn't hold a referendum, but anyhow, that was, again, I did not look at that as doing China's bidding at all. I looked upon that as the U.S. saying, hey, you know, we want peace in the Taiwan Strait. We don't want China to conquer Taiwan. We want Taiwan's democracy to continue. But Taiwan's democracy has to understand that there are dangers out there.
Could the people of Taiwan, the government of Taiwan, have misunderstood? Because earlier on in the administration, didn't President Bush come up quite strongly? He made a few statements, or at least one statement in which he said that, you know, we would do what we need to.
Yeah, and then he backed off that very quickly. Yeah, that was like right at the beginning, February or something like that. No. I have been there previously, so no. I mean, you know, the visit, I forget when my first visit was. I think it was in June, maybe. Yeah, it was May and June. I went off to Malaysia after that. No. I mean, the first letter was very polite and not as direct, and my conversation was more direct and very polite.
Right.
but not so polite they couldn't understand. I think I did about half of that in Chinese too. And their interpreter was fine.
No grounds for misinterpretation.
Yeah. So no, that first meeting was pretty clear, and we still felt compelled to have a second meeting 6 months later.
Sure. What about what some critics say, or point to, that there were that the U.S. did not file a report with the UN CHR, I guess in the first 3 years of the presidency? Did that have anything to do with holding back?
I don't know. I mean, it's funny because I did as political counselor, I was responsible for human rights in Beijing. And I'm trying to recall, we did have the human rights dialogue. But I'm trying to think, did we have any support at all in the UNHCR? I think it died for lack of interest. Basically, maybe that was a case of a little bit of support, but I also think that, a little bit of trying to go soft on China. Maybe that was one, but no, I actually think it was kind of, why should we bat our head against this wall because nobody in the world's going to support us? Getting back to my comments on the Europeans, they had begun to lose any interest in beating up at the Chinese on human rights, and we didn't have any support anyplace else. So, maybe it was viewing the UN as HCR as just going into bat our heads against a wall. And don't forget, support in general for UN fell off pretty dramatically, and interest in doing things in the UN fell off pretty dramatically. So I don't recall the fight, if there was any, over that.
Right. Would you agree with, again, critics who say that, because the U.S. Took a particular stance towards China in those days, that the Chinese were able to launch the so-called charm offensive, that they were able to, build relations with other countries in Asia in such a way that it sort of paved the way for their maybe more aggressive position today?
Okay, I don't want to build a false dichotomy here, but what was the option? That we would be trying to contain China while fighting wars in the Middle East? And even then, if we had tried to contain China, we would have just succeeded in annoying and scaring all of our Asian friends. So I don't really see how we encouraged them to go on a charm offensive, and I don't really see how we could have prevented them from trying to make friends with countries in the region. I think it's just kind of a, what do you mean? I'm not sure I understand what the other policy option was. Are they arguing for containment?
I guess they're suggesting that perhaps the U.S. could have continued to press hard on China.
Continued? From when?
From, I guess, the earlier Clinton era.
From 2 years or a year and a half under President Clinton? Yeah, no, that's continued to do things. I don't see that at all.
Or it's just one of those criticisms that you read about, that suggests that.
No, I guess somebody like that should do policy at some point. I don't. Nobody responsible was arguing for containment of China in 2001 to 2004. Did not make any sense as a policy option. Absent that, how could you justify a policy of trying to prevent Asian countries from making friends with China, or preventing China from making friends with Asian countries? China would do what is in its interest. And like I said, as we define our core interests, certainly in that period, that would not be one of our core interests. We all wanted to have a kumbaya Asia where everybody got along well. That was, if you look at it, in the 20th century, we failed miserably at accommodating the rising powers, right? Germany and Japan led to two world wars. Looking at the end of the 20th century, you're saying, how do we prevent the same thing from happening in the 21st century? Like I said, part of it is getting the neighbors right. And that's still probably the single most important part. part of it was trying to make sure China worked within a rules-based system, okay? And part of that was getting them into the WTO, and part of that was getting them to play responsibly in the region, going to things like the EAS or the ARF, and the third one, which we've always had very limited ability to, was to encourage any signs of positive reform we've had. So those three things haven't changed. We're doing okay on the first, partly because we're doing not so well on the second, and miserably on the third. So people are getting more and more afraid of China in the region.
In 2003, the Abu Ghraib incident came out into the open, and of course, then Guantanamo became a flashpoint. Did that in any way make things harder in terms of Asia policy?
Not too much, really. I mean, it did get publicity. The Chinese used it in some ways, and they made sure their public knew about it. Again, I get back to people looking at the world through a European/Latin American prism, where these things were hugely important. Mm-hmm. Because I think in many of the countries I dealt with, people assume that that's what governments do to some degree. I don't think, even while the Chinese attacked us on what happened in Abu Ghraib, I don't think that they could convince the people that conditions in their prisons were all that good, and that nothing like this would ever happen under the Chinese Communist Party. I think it caused concern among intellectuals throughout the region. Governments tended to look at their own interests and say, okay, does this affect us in any fundamental way? Like I said, the Guantanamo thing, in terms of the debate as to whether we can send people back, I think caused us to miss an opportunity with respect to China. But not the end all or be all by any means.
Mm-hmm. So you didn't get a sense that perhaps some of these governments used that as a cover, Abu Ghraib, sort of as a cover for what they were doing to their own dissidents?
You're hard put to say that the Americans are torturing people in Iraq, therefore we can torture people. I mean, it makes the argument is stronger that it makes it tougher for us to raise human rights issues. In that sense, I guess bilateral ambassadors would have problems in specific places. Although I'll tell you, the other example I was going to raise with respect to 9/11's impact on human rights was, if you recall, 2003, the year of the APEC summit in Bangkok, it kicked off with the Thai government conducting a war on drugs, where basically the cops got to shoot anybody they didn't like. And on that one, I went out on a pre-APEC tour. I think this was also May or June of 2003. And I was going to meet with the foreign minister, who knew that I wanted to talk about the war on drugs, and he refused to meet with me. But the deputy prime minister, Shavalit, the general, former chief of army staff, agreed to meet with me. I gave him a very strong message saying, look, you got what, 3,000 or 4,000 people dead? None of them by trial, half of them rumored just to be guys who certain cops didn't like, and it's going to be very embarrassing for the president to come out under those situations. And Shavalit heard me out, and since he was an army guy and didn't like the police anyhow, whole thing ended like about 3 weeks later, 2 or 3 weeks later, and I'm sure it was us making them nervous about the backdrop for the big Bangkok APEC meeting coming up. So in that case, I was sent out to issue a strong human rights message, and it was very clearly heard, if not by the foreign minister.
You're probably familiar with the U.S. Senate report on torture that came out end of last year.
I'm familiar with it. I haven't read it.
there was mention of Thailand as a first black site. Was that something that
I knew nothing
came
about
across?
it. No, I knew nothing about it.
And why would Thailand have been the choice?
They're an ally. We'd reach out to all allies. They also have a history of having a strong station, a big station, CIA station. So I imagine, nobody ever told this to me, and it was nothing I ever got involved in, that we reached out to places that were either formal or allies, or at least very close friends, where we had strong station connections.
And there's a strong station there because of Vietnam? Was that a holdover from Vietnam?
Yeah. And later became drug smuggling, and there's always been a big station there.
Okay. So now you left the NSC in 2004?
2004, January.
And then went on to become ambassador to Nepal, right? That was the next post. So even though you remain in government, obviously you could see the development of policy from a sort of greater distance after 2004. What was your sense of how policy developed post-2004?
Oh, from the again, from the Asia perspective, and this is a repeated theme of mine. I mean, the U.S. media and frankly U.S. academics prefer to look at the world through a European prism. I thought the development, with one huge exception, was pretty satisfactory in Asia, given the variables over which we have no control. Again, I think we were doing a good job on the things that, as an old China hand, struck me as most important. China, Japan, India. I thought we were doing really good, making good progress. Pakistan, of course, was Pakistan, and I happened to be acting Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia when Musharraf basically began the process of getting taken down by the Supreme Court. So that's Pakistan. But if you look at South Asia writ fairly broadly, Japan, we were doing pretty well. The one thing that had not turned out well, but again, I'd lump this into something over which we didn't have much control, was the six-party process and North Korea's nuclear program. And there, I don't really blame anyone, because, the six-party process was begun basically to try and use as much leverage as we could, but particularly Chinese leverage, to get North Korea to change its behavior. Okay, and we assumed that if China became worried enough about the North Korean program, it would have enough leverage to force North Korea to change. Okay, now 5 or 6 years later, it became clear that wasn't working. Now, you'll hear two completely different interpretations why. The most common one you'll hear nowadays, particularly from people who work with China all the time, is that China doesn't have that leverage. I disagree with that. I do believe China has the leverage. They can close the border and bring North Korea to its knees, except the reason I believe they don't do that is China has different priorities. We had always assumed that the fear of a nuclearized Northeast Asia would drive China's policy towards Korea. No. What drives China's policy towards Korea is the desire for the continued existence of a North Korean buffer state, a desire to prevent reunification of the peninsula under a democratic South Korean government, Republic of Korean government. These are probably unprovable at the current time. At some point, they might become provable. And at some point, the concerns might shift. Because back in 2007, 2008, there was really no worry about Japan and or South Korea going nuclear. That was what was driving our analysis back in 2002, 2003, was that at some point the Chinese were going to get really nervous that the Japanese and or South Koreans might develop their own arsenals. Well, frankly, that future is starting to look a little bit closer to me now. And, I'm not doing this full time, so I could just be totally wrong here. So I think there is still possibility that we, at some point, will see whether China really has the leverage. Right now, everybody comes back from China and says, oh, the Chinese are so upset with North Korea. They were telling me that 15 years ago when I was political counselor in Beijing, and I do believe it. And I do believe that anger and concern continues to grow as Kim Jong-un starts looking goofier and goofier all the time. But I don't think it's grown far enough so that the Chinese have used all their leverage. They can crush the North Korean economy in a month, and they've chosen not to do that.
Now, early on, you had mentioned, very early on in the interview, you had mentioned China's foreign policy and how it sort of, there was a major turn in its policy around 2007, 2008, 2009?
No, 2009.
2009, okay.
Yeah, and the interesting thing that people need to remember is that it started under Hu Jintao. It didn't start under Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping's obviously a different sort of leader, so we can get into that later. But basically, no, I think things rode out the second term of the administration in okay shape with China. It was the recession, the Chinese response to the recession, and a feeling of basically a lot of hubris in China, including at the top levels of the leadership, that now we've become the indispensable engine of the global economy. And you begin to see the debate about basically dropping that Tao Guang theory, hide your capabilities, keep your head low, hide your capabilities while developing your capabilities argument. By 2010, that was abandoned. And nobody uses that anymore. That doesn't describe policy. And again, predating Xi Jinping. So the most logical explanation is that it was the recession, the Chinese belief that they had not only weathered it well, but had helped pull the globe out of that recession. Therefore, we are already a great power, and we need to act like a great power.
So by that analysis, there was very little that the U.S. really could have done on that score to have in some ways.
Yeah, I don't see a whole bunch. I mean, I don't blame the Obama administration for growing Chinese hubris. I don't think we've handled everything perfectly, but basically there was this shift where a China that had been careful all of a sudden goes to ASEAN meetings and says, hey, we're a big country. Small countries have to listen to big countries. That was my old friend Yang Jiechi. They wouldn't have said that in 2005. They wouldn't have said it in 2007. But by 2010 or 11, they were making that clear.
So you had said, so going back now again to the earlier part of the interview, you had said, when Condi Rice came in 2 weeks after 9/11, she had talked about, looking at the world through a different prism. But nonetheless, and you emphasized it, there were continuities as much as there were discontinuities. Now, we've gone into a lot of detail in the last couple of hours. So just as a sort of backward glance, what would you say were the continuities and what were the discontinuities?
Okay, every administration comes in kind of doing a bottom-up review saying, what are we going to change? Okay? And if you look at it closely, things don't change that much because U.S. interests don't change that much, except in these big leaps, where all of a sudden a new threat arises. That can be evolutionary or it can be revolutionary. It can be because Pearl Harbor or 9/11 can be evolutionary, sort of the growing realization that the Soviet Union had occupied all of Eastern Europe and had no intention of giving it up. It was going to continue in other areas, so you get the policy of containment. That wasn't one day Truman woke up saying we got to do this. That was a whole series of things. China, I would argue, over the past 6 years, has fallen into that category. All of a sudden, you have a much more aggressive China than you did a few years back. So that's going to change U.S. policy. Okay, but it doesn't change in all areas. So where was the continuity in Asia? Well, I'd say that by the end of the Clinton administration, there was a clear recognition that we had to be getting India better than we had in the past, that we had to sort of figure out a way to kind of disengage from the Pressler sanctions and all that and try to come up with a new relationship with India. But they didn't get very far on it. So if you look at it, I think both administrations since then have worked at it pretty vigorously and tried to do their best to build a new relationship. Discontinuity on North Korea, but again, just pretty much forced by North Korea's own announcement that it had an HEU program. Other areas of continuity, I would say the gradual swing to Asia as a whole, even though it was hard to see because of this tremendous flap and everybody focused on first Afghanistan and then Iraq. Mm-hmm. If you look at the end of that period, 2008, you had bigger embassies, you had, where's the continuity? You had much greater trade than you had previously. You had basically a shift in U.S. interest towards Asia occurring, totally hidden by the focus, rightfully, on things like a war in Afghanistan and then the war in Iraq.
Do you feel like, would you say that this shift, that of course Secretary Clinton, I think they call it the pivot, and since then we've been talking about the pivot to Asia.
No, we've been talking about the rebalance because they said that and then everybody pushed back. And Mike Green being one of the strongest to push back on it.
So this rebalance to Asia. Would you say that, and of course this rebalancing, which seems at least from the point of view of outsiders like myself, seem to be constantly an attempt to move that way, or turn attention that way, and constantly pulled back towards the Middle East. Is that a legacy of the Bush administration?
Yeah, and it's a legacy of U.S. national interests. Any administration tries to do its best to serve what it sees as U.S. national interests. And again, getting back to my recent comment, basically, when you have well over half your trade with one portion of the world, where you see the fastest growing economies in that portion of the world, where you see the biggest rising challenge to your global status in that part of the world, then an administration would be pretty foolish not to say that we have to increasingly focus on Asia. So yeah, that was beginning during the Bush administration, and I would argue all 8 years quietly going on underneath the ground, State Department going through diplomatic initiatives and right-sizing initiatives and all that. But the military portion being hidden, but meanwhile, all the rest of this going on. American markets voting for themselves, American academics voting for themselves, building relationships with institutions in Asia. So that's going on. And yeah, I would say that started pretty clearly. There was an attempt under President Bush. It has clearly gotten a name currently, and that's why Mike Green objected strongly to the pivot phraseology, because hey, we've been doing this.
Right.
We've been trying to get this done. And again, also don't forget that was in the context of 2 years where the Obama administration did try to reach out to the Chinese fairly vigorously and ended up with getting slapped around pretty badly. So, and looking a little bit foolish on it. Mm-hmm. So they've come up with a name. If you get a Republican administration coming in, they'll drop the name. It will no longer be called a rebalance. And they'll come up with another far-reaching term to describe what they're doing on Asia, and what it will amount to is more and more focus on Asia. Mm-hmm. Will it be a continuous increase? No. It'll be a sine curve gradually going up, because you will have crises in Crimea. Russia will be a suck-on time. Nobody knows what we'll end up doing with ISIS. So, these things will happen. But frankly, they don't represent the threat to the U.S. global standing over time that China does, nor, just as importantly, the huge opportunity for the United States that Asia does. As you can tell, I talk about this a lot. And I am a true believer.
Now, as an Asia hand, what was your view? What is your view of when Condi Rice, as Secretary of State, when she failed to show up at some of these talks, ASEAN, ARF, and so on? What did you think?
I think it's a missed opportunity. I think it's too bad. I don't know exactly what's going on with anybody's schedule at any particular time. President Clinton didn't go to the APEC in Kuala Lumpur, and he sent Vice President Gore, and Vice President Gore said some things that bothered the Malaysian hosts, and but that was a missed opportunity too. And then it makes it a little tougher for us to dig out next time, and as somebody committed to Asia, I say every missed opportunity is precisely that. It's a missed opportunity. And it does make it a little bit harder to climb out. It does make people question credibility to some degree. 3 years ago, the biggest problem with the pivot or rebalance to Asia was a lot of our friends were scared that this would lead to confrontation with the Chinese, that the U.S. would provoke confrontation with China, and they unspokenly would be forced to choose sides. Now, the biggest concerns of our friends and allies is that we're not that serious about it, that we won't commit the resources a long time to make it effective. That's a huge change. So again, the Chinese are doing half of our work. They're not doing all of our work. The other half is first half is setting the environment. The second half is delivering what you need to deliver to help shape the future environment. And, that's up to us.
Well, I've actually run through my list of questions.
Hey, great.
But I just wonder, at this point, has there been anything that I've missed? Is there something that needs to be said for the record?
Is your focus solely on 9/11?
No, it's simply a sort of benchmark.
Benchmark, okay. It is a useful benchmark, but getting back to my earlier comments, a lot of what we did was not revolving around that benchmark. We spent a lot of time on the Pak-India nuclear crisis. The president spent a lot of time, and it came out pretty well, and it sort of laid the basis for that outreach to India. Again, that was a topic over which there was much debate within the administration, and it was a debate basically between the keepers of the faith on proliferation issues versus the global strategists, all of whom could see the benefit of a closer relationship with India. The big question is, how do you let this undeclared nuclear power back into the club of respectable nations? And so that took a lot of heavy lifting within the administration. The president stuck with it, and we got it done. And that made the progress we've had over the past 11 years or so possible, 10 years or so possible. So again, if I look at where we came out in Asia after the 4 years I was there, but frankly, even after the 8 years, I'd say we were in a lot better shape than we went in. And again, that's a story that I don't think people realize, is that, the whole world hated Americans after the Bush presidency. No, the whole world didn't hate Americans. And if you look at the sheer question of whether we had done an effective job trying to advance U.S. interests, by and large, yeah. And again, that was despite big differences. North Korea being in some ways the toughest, because, other than the president himself, everybody wanted to interpret his endorsement of the six-party process as an endorsement for whatever they wanted to do in the first place. Whether it was the State Department wanting to conduct bilateral talks with the North Koreans, or the Defense Department wanting to begin complete international isolation of the North Koreans. So, it was tough riding herd, but the president stuck with it. And, that was a very time-consuming process. The Philippines, again, like I said, a legacy of mistrust among much of the bureaucracy that had to be sort of overcome to revive the relationship with the Philippines. And if that work hadn't started, by the time you get to Scarborough Shoal or anything like that, the Philippines would be in much worse shape, and our ability to respond in the South China Sea would be greatly inhibited.
Actually, I do have a follow-up question as you were talking came to mind, and that is with regards to Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of made a couple of times you suggested that it was sort of a country that we've had some trouble figuring out. What exactly do you mean?
Indonesia is so big and so far away that, and look around, how many, for a country of 250 million people with a fast-growing economy, how much academic firepower is spent on Indonesia in the United States? It's more than it was 15 years ago, but it's not a huge amount by any means. We have a lot more experts on Germany or France than we do on Indonesia. And Indonesia has changed so rapidly since 1997. It's just been boom, boom, boom. Again, I came back in August from almost a year there, and I came back fairly optimistic about ASEAN and very optimistic about Indonesia. They've done difficult things, and they've done some things that look screwy from the outside that are very important. Again, my context, I served in Bangladesh as ambassador, and I've watched Thailand. So I've seen two democracies with very unitary states run into trouble because of those unitary states. There's no way to let minorities express themselves. You can't control an important provincial government because there aren't any. You have no resources, you have no authority. Indonesia was like that up until the Big Bang in whatever it was, 2002, 2003, where they devolved. And everybody says, oh, look at all this corruption and all these more opportunities. Well, you had huge corruption before, and now you have people who get caught. More importantly, you don't have a winner-take-all system where all power lies in Jakarta. Have you spent much time in Indonesia?
I actually have, yes.
Yeah, it's so darn diverse. It's so big. It's so messy that to try and pretend that you could have a unitary democracy in a place like that is absurd. So I'm fairly optimistic that they're going to do all right over the long term. They've made that really difficult big decision. Because of it, you ended up with a guy named Jokowi as president. And we might get frustrated at him, but if it's either him or Prabowo, or if it's either him or Megawati coming back, or Kala, he would not have existed without decentralization. What's her name? The lady in Surabaya, the second most popular politician in the country, who's made a fetish of transparency, putting all contracting out on the web and all that stuff. She's the second most popular politician in the country. She would not exist without decentralization. The Megawatis of the world would be the ones still trying to call the shots, and Prabowos and people like that. So, it's a messy place, but I'm actually pretty optimistic about it. And no, I don't think Americans know a lot about it. We're going to get better on it. I think having a president who spent time in there helped in terms of forcing some degree of focus on it. I think the dawning recognition that ASEAN will play a role, particularly as we look at South China Sea questions. And frankly, with the Natuna Islands, which are just outside the line and have EEZ within the line, you're saying, hey, Indonesia's a player there, and it will be over the coming years. So I think we'll be getting Indonesia right. I think we'll be getting ASEAN right, and I think they're very important as we look at rebalancing. But if you also look at it, again, a country of 250 million people with an economy that's growing reasonably quickly, that's important.
And I hate to have to hammer this point, but
Yeah.
it occurs to me, so I have to ask it.
Sure.
In terms of Indonesia, because you say we don't have a firm grasp on the country because it's so complicated, at least in terms of the immediate years after 9/11, would it be fair to say that we looked at that the U.S. looked at Indonesia mostly through the lens of 9/11 and Muslim fundamentalism?
There was a lot of that and a lot of concern, but again, an increasingly sophisticated concern as time went by that, look, this ain't Saudi Arabia, it's not Iraq, it's a 80% Muslim, 85% Muslim country that where you have pockets of extreme Islam, but the dominant Islam is actually fairly moderate. And so, okay, how do you address this? There was a lot of frustration with the Leahy Amendment, of course, and there was an assumption that we could work to make them more effective in the kinetic side, but there was also a recognition that, hey, longer term, we can probably find a fairly fertile ground to work with them on the longer term issues. And there was a question of, how do you take back the debate within Islam? And those of us from South and Southeast Asia said, you've got potential allies here, but they've got to figure out how they can do that within their own political context. And so there was frustration at the Leahy Amendment. There was a growing recognition, particularly after SBY came into power, that these were guys we could work with. And I say that, and that's a little ex post facto, but you look at the Indonesians who came through the White House while I was there. The two most impressive, one was Dino, who never spoke to the president, and the other was SBY, who did speak to Condi, at least, and I think he got in with the president, but I wasn't there for some reason. I know he spoke with Condi, and he was pretty impressive. He was a sharp guy, and I think there was a recognition that while looking at Indonesia, you got to be a little more sophisticated and try and understand it. Karen Brooks was very active, and people trusted her and respected her a lot, and she does know Indonesia very well. So that helped. That helped raise levels in the White House quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, that's all I've got. Anything else?
No. What time is it? I couldn't even keep it busy till noon. I don't blame the Obama presidency for what's happened with respect to China. Those were just natural developments, and I can't think of any way that we could have or should have prevented those natural developments. I do think going forward, as I said in the past, we have to be very clear where our core national interests lie. We have to draw pretty clear bottom lines. I think there's always a danger of fudging those, and I think the first couple of years the Obama administration might have been doing that a little bit. The Chinese are forcing them to be clearer and clearer. Meanwhile, the work continues with the alliances. So getting back to that theory of evolutionary change in policy, that's what you're seeing right now. The rebalance is an evolution that will continue. And it will continue partly because that's where the challenges are, but the opportunities are there too. So I'm repeating that again, but
always worth repeating. And just to make it explicit, how do you understand U.S. national interests when you say, it is important to maintain those? What are those exactly?
With respect to China?
With respect to China.
I get back to what I was saying earlier, that they've got to be a power that plays by the international rules. We've got to do what we can, and it's very, very limited to encourage reform. And we've got to get the allies, the neighbors, as right as we can. India is still the big variable. I think that having Modi in charge helps, because you do have somebody who unites India much better than anybody has for the past 30 years, and somebody who can at least try to make decisions and try to get the bureaucracy to implement. You haven't had that in India for a long time. And I think the confluence of interests is there so that you're going to see that working out over time. So if you want to look at what we got to do, is we got to try and make sure they play by the rules. If we need to talk to them about the rules, Even if the rules have to change slightly, fine, let's do it. But don't let them change rules unilaterally. Don't let them go back on their commitments in 2002 to ASEAN. Don't allow the building of islets to go unchallenged. And it doesn't sound like we are going to. I think the Chinese believed that we gave them more of a green light in the South China Sea than we did, and that might be because we were a little unclear. And now we've got to be very clear going forward. And for example, one thing that I think has to change is that all claims to sovereignty are not created equal. The 9-dash line is absolutely ridiculous. We can't put it in those terms, but we have to make it clear that all claims should be based on current international law. All we got to do is say that. Because a Ming Dynasty map resurrected by the KMT so that the French wouldn't move into the Paracels? It just doesn't have any validity. And we've got to keep on telling them that, or we've got to start saying that. We're getting a little bit to that now, but not much. Over time, we will get to that. If we had been saying that from the beginning, it would have been a lot better. It would have given the Chinese pause to think. Maybe it wouldn't have worked, but at least they would have known where we stood on the issue. Now they're going to claim that, once we move to something that can be interpreted as all claims are not created equal, they're going to scream bloody murder. And frankly, if ITLOS comes down with a decision that limits their sovereignty or refuses to recognize their sovereignty in some cases, they'll scream bloody murder, and they'll say, it has no validity. At that point, we have the golden opportunity to say, hey, it really does have no standing. The claims have no standing, cannot be justified under current international law. Got to be willing to do that. In a way, I'm worried more about confrontation coming out of the South China Sea than the East China Sea, because they're still scared of the Japanese, and they're not scared of the Filipinos, and they're not scared of the Vietnamese.
But those were not issues that had appeared during the Bush administration.
Not really, no. No, I mean, again, Koizumi's relationship with the Chinese was okay for a Japanese prime minister. And it was Abe coming in, before the real Chinese hubris rose, but Abe coming in and sort of the Yakasuni shrine and all that coming back up as a big issue. It's always an issue with the Chinese. And you got to remember that the Chinese never gave up the drumbeat against Japan's actions in the war, just like they've never given up the Opium War. Yeah, I was there for the 150th anniversary of the Opium War, which was the year after Tiananmen. And so for 2 weeks before the anniversary, every paper, every newscast was dominated by reporting on the Opium War and the atrocities committed against China at that time. So that you can't expect the Chinese to give up the drumbeat against Japan, but they can moderate it at times. And they can increase it either because of something Japan does or because of something that's driven internally. Taiwan, like I said, was the big issue in U.S.-China relations because of the DPP presidency in Taiwan at the time, and more importantly because of Chen Shui-bian being more of a loose cannon than we thought he would be. Tsai Ing-wen stands a good chance of getting elected, and she was one of those Taiwanese officials who seemed overly optimistic about what Taiwan could do in the cross-strait relationship. If she gets elected, she's still going to be racing towards that Taiwanese middle, I think. And that said, in 2005, after I left the White House, the Chinese passed this anti-sedition law. And that means that the status quo ante should not stand indefinitely under Chinese law And that gives people who want to attack Xi Jinping something to attack him with. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking for flashpoints, I'd say in the immediate future, it is Taiwan. It is the South China Sea. But longer term, Taiwan could come back big time too.